All right, well, it's a real honor to be here on this panel. As you look around here and just seeing who we have up here, I think it's a great mix. So I think we all know Griffin here, Catherine Austin Fitz, and Philip Kowski, Ellen Brown, and David Seaman here on the end. What we're going to talk about today is Bitcoin being a flagless currency. And I think this is a really interesting subject. It's taking it, expanding how we think about a currency away from a sovereign, what we all know as a sovereign U.S. dollar. So I'm going to open it up. Let's start down here with David. If you could just talk about this. David's probably on this panel, I can guess, probably a little bit more fluid with Bitcoin talking about this. And if you could talk about that and talk about that particular subject to kind of get us going.
Yeah, of course. It's a cool subject. It wasn't my topic, but definitely it's right up my alley because I think that consumer behaviors are shifting. And so many people criticize the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and the whole central bank model, right? They're rectangles of paper issued by some central authority, has somebody's face on it, has a serial number. You shove it into an ATM machine, they're pretty much all interchangeable. They're all the same. So if consumer behavior changes to where we accept a digital token, as long as it's rare, as long as it's issued by some authority that we respect, and it doesn't have to be a bank, it doesn't have to be a brick and mortar building, it can be math, it can be anything. In the case of crypto, it is math. So I think that the establishment screwed themselves. In the short term, they got nearly unlimited money, right? You have uncapped, unbacked central banks, but now you have 7.5 billion people who've been basically brainwashed by the mainstream media and by pop culture and by rap videos that you want unbacked $100 bills, just rectangles of paper issued by Janet Yellen. She seems like a nice lady. I've never met her. But like, there you go. You have your issuing authority, and apparently that's all people need. The gold bugs hate hearing that because gold is it's got so much going on. That's the reality, though, is consumers just want rarity and they just want a token to shuttle around. So the nation state might not be the dominant issuing authority, and I don't think it will be. There's still a need for services, building roads, accommodating war, all of that stuff. One thing there's no longer a need for are people like Janet Yellen. So.
You want to say anything, Catherine?
Okay. What's interesting about this is this morning Colin said that this is a blockchain is like a tool, and like a hammer, you can use a hammer to build a house, or you can use a hammer to hit somebody over the head. So I think the issue is, how will this tool be used? Now, if it goes on its current trajectory, I think it's going to be very centralizing. So, for example, I think if you look at the central banking system now, let's presume for a second that North Korea and Syria are, if the U.S. has their way, forced into the BIS system. The blockchain technology gives the ability of any bank that has the authority of force, because control on this planet is run by physical force. So any bank that can bring that force to bear can use the blockchain essentially to dramatically reduce the number of banks and the number of alternatives, bring things online in a very consolidating way. Think of, just as Amazon is trying to do it in the food business, think of the same thing in the financial business. I think if you look at the last 20 years, we've seen technology combined with criminal enterprise used to really consolidate the banking business in the United States into the really big banks. Because those banks are the depository for the US government, and essentially, as Ed's described, in much greater eloquence than I can, they have basically the authority of the sovereign force. Now, the federal government is no longer a sovereign government. We're talking about it as though it has power, and it's sovereign. It doesn't have operational sovereignty, it doesn't have information sovereignty, and it doesn't have financial sovereignty. I mean, literally, the big contractors and the banks control the federal government. And what the federal government does is it has liabilities. It has liabilities to our pension fund, it has liabilities to our retirement savings. If we just say, oh, the federal government's bad, and we pull it down, what we will do is succeed in extinguishing the liabilities and concede the entire field to the banks that are growing ever bigger. So I think we have to be very, one of my favorite quotes, a British intelligence officer once said, George Washington didn't beat us in the Revolutionary War, he out-intelligenced us. And I think everyone in this room shares a desire for decentralization and a desire for freedom. And the question is, how can we use those tools to be more free? But we have to be much more savvy about understanding who's centralizing. And I assure you the government is just one of their vacuum cleaners. It's just one of their mechanisms. We don't want to pull down the government and end up with them, doubling and tripling their force. So I think we need to think very seriously about who's behind the centralization, who's in the governance system, how does it work, and how do we use these and many other tools. I think blockchain is very powerful. So, for example, we can use blockchain to re-engineer and re-optimize on the asset side of the economy and just get the finance guys out. I hate to say this, I'm a finance guy, but we would all be better off if we just deleted them out of health insurance, if we deleted them out of, all these different industries. And so blockchain to me is very powerful and provides tremendous opportunity. My big issue, I got to beat this drum because I always do, there's more than $19 trillion now missing from the federal accounts. Federal government has refused to comply with Article 1, the appropriations clause, requiring transparency accounts and laws related to audited financial management. I would love to see us figure out how to use blockchain to get that $19 trillion back. Because you get that back, then you have enough money to bring down the government, but still keep our obligations and not give the people who've stolen that $19 trillion a free pass. So with that,
I'm going to turn it over to Ellen Brown because she's kind of addressed this and things. What about just creating the $1 trillion coin?
Yeah, that would be a way for the government to actually get the power back. I mean, I would disagree that our money is pieces of paper with faces on them. That's only 5% of the money supply. 95% of the money supply is digital already, and it's created by banks when they make loans. So they are the power, not the federal government. And the 5% is created by the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank, which has declared its independence from the government. So the only thing that the government really does is coins, which is like minuscule part of the money supply. The Constitution says Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, but it doesn't say what the value is. So Congress could step in and issue a few $1 trillion coins and actually have their own money and not be dependent on these banks that are now in control of our money system.
right.
So I think also money is becoming appified, and Steve Jobs, before he died, part of the vision behind the iPhone, I believe, was that you would have an app economy, that you could build this closed loop app that does one thing really well. Good examples are, of course, Uber, things like that. And I think that currency is becoming actually appified. So yeah, I agree with you that it's money on a screen somewhere. But because consumer behavior has gotten to the point where we accept unbacked fiat, whereas 100 years ago, from peasant all the way up to king and queen, you give somebody a sheet of paper with the king's face on it, they go, can I redeem this for gold immediately when I want to? And then you say no, they say no thanks. I mean, that was just 100 years ago or 150 years ago. Now we're in this dystopian mass media world. People will accept tokens, unbacked tokens for work. So the question becomes, who is the issuing authority? And what are the terms of service, basically? If money's an app, the Federal Reserve has the worst terms of service I've ever heard of, right? It's like 95% pre-mined, it's gone, hopefully you can get it back, the 19 trillion. But like a significant portion of that wealth has just been vaporized somewhere. It's been deep stated. A lot of it's used on war, and then it's leased out to the banks, gets funneled down to the rest of us. I see a shift in consumer behavior itself. I can only make so much money per year. I get to choose which currencies I want to earn in. Because I have a smartphone and I'm on, coincap.io half the day, I'm always looking at values. So in 10 years, just take that consumer behavior with no changes in government, no collapse. Just take that same consumer behavior and run that program for a decade, and every consumer is into currency because it's a social status thing, it's a survival thing. And 31 years of using the US dollar, I've never woken up one morning, oh my God, I have 30% more purchasing power. I've done that before with crypto, and what that does is it hooks you in. It's an app economy. The apps that people are on all day are games, freaking games where you earn nothing. Wait until there's a monetary layer, which now there is. What is Ethereum? It's people stealing money from each other in flawed smart contracts. I mean, it'll be more advanced in a few years, but that's what it is right now. People like games, so.
But if we're transacting on a digital system, I mean, this has been the federal government's problem. They don't have information sovereignty, so they can't have a private transaction or a private conversation without a variety of private interests listening and having access to the information. So it was interesting, I just saw one fellow who just left the Trump administration said that in the first 25 days, there were 25 national security leaks compromising national security. So the government doesn't have information sovereignty. How can we go free if we're transacting on a platform where we don't have privacy or information sovereignty?
Right, your checking account, you don't have privacy, right? The FBI can just see everything you've ever done.
I don't have privacy on anything. Not in my house, not on my phone, not on my computer, no place.
In your mind.
Well, there are people who debate that. You know, I think I do, but, you know, I don't have, but, you know, it's what yeah, they're working on that too. Glenn Greenwald called it the one-way mirror. And to me, the power of the one-way mirror, you know, if you go through the layers of different control, the control always comes back to force. And I think that's why the judge in his speech today said, you know, some of us are going to have to be on the ramparts, you know, and it won't be nice. But we're in a system that's run by force. So how are we going to deal with that? Because if a small centralized group control us by force, you know, we can get on these systems and do all sorts of things, but ultimately they're going to have control. I mean, look what
People's Bank of China tried their play at that, right? They closed the drawbridge.
Here's my question for all of us. What did Mnuchin's threat on the SWIFT system and the Korean sanctions have to do with the Chinese doing what they did to Bitcoin? I don't know. Presumably the Koreans were using Bitcoin to launder. And it is clearly extremely important to have everybody in the BIS system, so they want Korea in. So this is a very high-pressure point, but if they can get the Chinese to do that, what can they get you and me to do? So I think we have to look at what is the real governance system on this planet, who's really in control, and how do we set up a way of going about this that we make sure we really do kick it into decentralization mode? How do we make sure these tools are decentralizing, not centralizing? Because if it goes the way it's going now, I see them as being very powerfully centralizing.
You're just centralizing a protocol, though, so it's better for us than any other form of centralization if it comes to that. Because eventually you will get centralization of protocols, I think. I think you'll have the store of value coin, Bitcoin probably. You'll have Ether for more complex financial agreements and for decentralized apps. Maybe you'll have Nexus or something like that just to build out alternate internets because the internet's basically broken at a structural level. So yeah, I mean.
Well, let's talk about the threat, because obviously that's all very interesting. We're all here because of this. But we're still talking about a $20 trillion debt out there. We're still talking about a government that controls things. We're here talking about being a flagless.
Oh, wait. We're talking about a $20 trillion debt and $19 trillion missing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the Pentagon comes out every so often and tells us how much they lost last year. So how do we, to even get to this other decentralization's place, how do we get rid of this other problem? And I mean, I'm thinking of you, Ed, you outlined this from the beginning. What do we do right now with the Federal Reserve, and how do we get through this?
Yeah, that's a good cue. Thank you. I appreciate that. I was really worrying what on earth I could contribute to a conference like this. I'm glad they made my topic for tomorrow on the Federal Reserve. I can go all day on that. But Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, I'm just kind of a student still, maybe a middle-level student. So there's nothing that I can add except I have question marks and caution signs in my mind everywhere I look on this, because I see a lot of enthusiasm that I think is warranted, but I don't see the counter caution that should be there when you're going into unknown territory. And I debated the other night, how far should I go with raising these questions at a conference where there's obviously going to be a lot of enthusiasm. I don't like the idea of being tarred and feathered, so I thought I'll have to calm myself. But much to my surprise and great pleasure, I've noticed that everything I've listened to so far here includes cautionary ideas. And your idea, Catherine, is especially important, I think, because we have a tendency, when I say what your idea, I mean your observation that there is force behind this system. And I'd like to expand and say there's force behind every system.
Right.
And the question is, what is the system?
Right.
Do we like the system, or are we afraid of it, or being hurt by it? So and that brings me to the topic here, which is, what is the effect of cryptocurrency on international forces, and especially the flagless currency thing? Obviously, I think everybody, even a grade school kid, could see that it's going to de-emphasize the importance of Uncle Sam and the dollar. But that's not such a big deal, I don't think, because that's in the cards anyway, even if it weren't for cryptocurrency. We see that the other nations of the world are maneuvering, hovering like vultures, waiting for America to fall on her knees. They're trying to do everything they can to encourage our demise, and they're just waiting to come in and pick up the pieces, and it could be very ugly. And China has made no bones about America being enemy number one, and they still hold that point of view, and other areas of the world as well. So they are maneuvering as best they can in the economic field to weaken the U.S. dollar. And Uncle Sam, unfortunately, is probably doing more to do that than all of the enemies that we have. Our fiscal policy has been designed and held by our enemies. And I don't think, that's not our topic today, but it's worth thinking about, that it might have been in fact designed by our enemies. Just because they're U.S. citizens doesn't mean that they're not our enemies.
Right.
So I tend to favor that theory, that conspiratorial theory, I guess you'd call it, that there are those in our midst at the highest levels who really want to see the demise of our country. And this is one of the ways in which they are doing it. Now, that brings up the question, what comes afterwards? And another thing I was delighted to hear over and over again is that cryptocurrency is a tool. It's not an agenda. It's a tool that'll be held by people who do have agendas. If the tool were held by the people in this room, I'd be so happy. I can't imagine what a world it would be like. But it's not the way it's headed right now. We see the big banks. I guess it was I guess all of the big banks have big budgets, millions and millions of dollars, and hundreds of high-tech people working on blockchain technology. They see it as an inescapable part of our future. They want to be in on it. They want to control it. And they have the ability, I believe, to do it. And so if we ignore that, we're making a big mistake. If we just think, oh, it's wonderful, we're going to control this, and it will allow us to have a force field around us. We can do everything we want to do, and they won't be able to touch us. This is living in a dream world. They're going, if they succeed in what they plan to do, they're going to use even blockchain technology to enslave us. So the question comes back then, who is going to hold that force that we're talking about?
Right.
Who is going to be the holder of the tool? Is it going to be a hammer on the head, or is it going to build houses and make things by driving nails? Right now, the trend is both encouraging, in my view, and discouraging. I see a very rapid rise of awareness of people who are for the first time in their lives, being able to see that there's something wrong, very wrong with the system. And for the first time in my memory, it's easy to get people to listen. That's a new experience for me. I've always had to try and maneuver their thinking and talk about something that they're interested in. Seems like any topic you start with today, they're in it. They say, tell me more. So that's good, and that's encouraging because we need that kind of participation at the public level. But by the same token, I think our opponents, the PTB, as it's been called here a lot, I think that's a good name for it, or the deep state, whatever you want to call it, these people are no dummies. They have seen this coming for a long, long time. They knew it would happen. Their master plan included dealing with that phase of the final conversion. And I remember sitting next to a high-ranking military officer about, I'm going to guess 30 years ago, on an airplane. Forgotten the flight. He was in civilian clothes, by the way, but we got a conversation. I think he was a colonel. And we got to well, where are you coming from, Colonel? And he said, well, I'm coming from a big meeting, and we're discussing changes in military operations and styles of equipment. That's my specialty, is vehicles. And he said, we got into it. He wasn't spilling any national high classified information. He was just saying that the vehicles of the future will be, how did he phrase it? There's a military term for it, like troop carriers and crowd control, that kind of thing. In other words, it's not delivering soldiers into enemy territory or blowing up things at a distance with cannons. It's armored vehicles where you can deal with people in your own country. That was 30 years ago, and they saw it coming. And I never forgot that these people, he probably didn't even recognize why or with a bigger plan. He was just part of, say, yeah, we'll get this information down, and we'll do this kind of a vehicle, and it'll have those specs and so forth. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't have the master plan, but I sure had it. And so back to my point is that I think that what we're going through right now is not particularly a surprise to the PTB. It's a phase that they have planned for a long time. So now we come to the question that your cue to me is, how can we change the people who are going to hold this tool? And I'm glad that it turned in that direction, because now I'm back on my turf. I may not know so much about cryptocurrency, but I do know that if we want to change the quality and character of the people who will hold the tools, who will hold this coercive power, who will give the directions to the armies and to the police forces, we have to get to work at the social level, political level, and really get up off of our couches and get out into organizations where people work and live, and go to them. Don't expect them to come to our meetings and our conferences. We have to go to where they are. And so that's what I have been devoting all of my time to in the last few years, is to that issue. It can be done. We have a fellow that just came into our group recently who comes from the military. His specialty, by the way, was doing exactly this kind of thing, building units at the grassroots level in other countries. He was working for Uncle Sam to create counter-revolutionary movements in other countries. So he knows how this is done. And he said what the enemies used to do in other countries, they have been doing here in America for a long, long time. And he said, if you've noticed, ever since the election especially, all these groups have come up from the grassroots, apparently like mushrooms after a rain. There are all these organizations. He said, those are the kinds of organizations we must build. We can't do this on the internet. We can't do it with emails and a conference once a year. We have to build local units of people who have, not only they're there because they're mad or they're scared, they know they're going to have to fight. As the judge said, we might have to actually stand toe-to-toe, and some of us aren't going to make it. But not only that, we have to know what we want. How many Americans can tell you what they want? They know what they don't like. They want to be left alone. It's easy to say, get off my back, or leave me the hell alone, or whatever the phrase is. But okay, if they did that, and now we had to recreate a system to our liking, how many people would know how to build it? What are the qualities we need? And so I'm back on my theme again. That's why we have this thing called the Creed of Freedom. And there it is. I invite anybody to look that up. I think there is the theme. There is what we're fighting for. It's built into our own republic. When our Constitution was written, it was a republic. And everything in the Creed of Freedom was in there, but it wasn't spelled out quite as clearly defined as it might have been. And then we have to build these local groups that have pledged, the people have pledged their lives and their sacred honor to those principles. And we better do it soon, because otherwise we are going to what my military friend says is the final phase. He's given us 5 phases. He says we've gone through, we're in the 4th phase now, and we're nearing the end of the 4th phase. And the 5th phase is what he calls consolidation. That's a very clean word for a bloody event. Consolidation is where they go around and pick up people like you and me in the middle of the night, say into the truck, and that's the end of it. You know. So we're running out of time on that, but the salvation is in the local groups. The local groups. Was it the judge that today quoted Jefferson about that, and the locality of it all? I was so glad to hear that. So that's not a specific answer. I wish I could say, well, subscribe to this, or read this book, or join that organization, or make a donation to the Republican Party, or whatever it is, you know. No, it's going to take a lot more than that to change the system. Now, having said all that, I'll just wrap it up by saying I'm optimistic. I think it can be done, because we're coming to the phase now where it's easy to sell this idea, but it's going to be really exciting.
Let me bring in Flip here, because Flip, I would say, having listened to him a lot, does talk about some positive future roles of Bitcoin, about technology, how it can change things. How can we get into the future as you've actually envisioned it and you've articulated it, getting aside some of these other control issues with the government?
The important part of the blockchain that people, I think, occasionally miss, and that's where I don't worry about the banks absorbing private blockchains and being able to be as potent with it as a blockchain designed and existing the way it's intended. Intended in the sense that it's decentralized, intended and it's permissionless. It doesn't have the characteristics in a bank where 5 or 6 banks are the only ones allowed to run the blockchain. It loses its potency. And I think that Bitcoin, over a period of time, has technological improvements that will occur on an exponential basis. Performance, speed, ability to absorb value, ability to transact, provide miners, permissionless miners, the ability to earn a living on the transaction fees and on all of the other things that are required. I think that that makes it a universal currency, or at least potentially. It doesn't have to be called Bitcoin. It could be something else. I think there'll be many, many blockchains and many, many currencies with characteristics that are good for some specific purpose. But when you look at the currencies that are currently in play, you have to remember that the US dollar is arguably one of the top 2 or 3. I mean, I'd argue maybe it's number 1, but you know, somebody said the euro has got these characteristics that make it better. I don't have an argument for whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 even. But all I can tell you is the bottom quartile of those currencies are truly shit and worthless. Whether it's Venezuelan, whether it's South African rand, those people that are stuck living in a geography like that and want to be entrepreneurs don't have an opportunity to compete on a level playing field. They're competing at a very distinct disadvantage, having a currency like the rand, which cannot even be moved offshore. And that's just one of the things. This idea that for the last 100 years, people were kind of okay with faces on stuff, and before that they weren't, I think only misses the fact that 700 years of tally sticks did a good job and didn't have anybody's face on it at all.
Exactly.
It was literally an IOU. And we still have those currencies. I was just speaking earlier with the folks here, and I said, you know, there is still the VIR, which is a IOU currency that is now Swiss. It was originally German after World War I, where the mark was worthless, and they created a currency of IOU-like value. 60, 70,000 businesses still using it today. If you look at India and Pakistan. You've got currencies that were created purely for the textile business that have characteristics of this, and the tally stick, which I mentioned earlier, you take that and understand it, and it's a Bitcoin made out of wood. You know, it's a public and a private key, and all of the terms that we today are using in securities are often borrowed from the tally stick, including you used to take it to a stock broker who cut the thing in half. The only way those two pieces fit together was because nature made it that way. It's a fun little investigation that you can do. But I am absolutely certain that barring all of the calamities that can happen, there will be a desire and a need on a global basis for a currency that bypasses the borders, bypasses the translation process, and allows people on an equal footing, on an equal playing field to manage their finances, and better yet, be entrepreneurs. Because I think that has more value creation capability than just financial speculation.
How do you think Bitcoin or any of the currencies with a limited issuance or authority of what can be issued will make the transition once the full amount has been mined?
What somebody forgets, I think, is that the reason a Bitcoin is a Bitcoin is because Satoshi arbitrarily decided there were 8 decimal points in a computer word. Integer mathematics means that each word, depending on, and I don't need to go into the details, is about 2 quadrillion units.
Right.
So you've got 100 million subunits beyond a Bitcoin, supposedly there for microtransactions and other nifty things. But there's no value restriction on what a Bitcoin becomes. It can be $1 trillion each. Well, then you go, well, 100 millionth of that is still a big number. What do I do then? Easy. You add another word, and you subdivide the Satoshi, which is two quadrillion units, into yet another 2 quadrillion units. You have infinite amount of currency that you can create in that infinite number of units that you can create it, but the value absorption is what its value is to people like sitting in this room who transact in it or speculate in it, more likely today, but ultimately transact in it. One day there will be enough Bitcoin or cryptocurrency to buy every working business or real estate or whatever, because it'll need to have that much value, and if it is useful in transacting those, it'll start absorbing more and more value.
Yeah, it's like a Chinese finger trap for money, right? That's how I visualize it. Is, you know, people know the Chinese finger trap, right? The harder you try to pull out, the more the threads actually pull down on your fingers. It'll be the same thing where it's a value funnel. And I wanted to mention something about the powers that be. In the U.S., it's still the ATMs and the banks and ACH are the choke points. So we have an issue. It's still the chicken and the egg issue, I think. Like crypto's worth more today, and we have conferences now, whereas a couple years ago we really didn't. We had people showing up to coffee shops and people on Google Plus arguing with each other. But what they do is, since most consumers still look at a Bitcoin and they go, oh, that's a $4,500 Bitcoin. That's 2 months rent or whatever it is for that person. That's how they psychologically value it today. Maybe not in 30 years, but that's the real world we live in. And so what the powers that be do is they make it difficult for you to cash out. I haven't had any problems, but I've talked to pretty amateur traders, not big transactions, where the IRS has levied their bank accounts. It's an intimidation tactic. Oh, you're taking out money from Coinbase. Well, is that illegal? Is that illegal to do that? They're trying to intimidate you from using your own money. And the final choke point is the ATMs and the banks. My checking account doesn't let me take out more than $1,000 a day, which to me it doesn't seem like a lot of money, considering that's a small fraction of the balance you can hold in a checking account. That doesn't seem like a lot of money. So those are the choke points, and they can say, oh, you didn't do the AML thing here, and they can arbitrarily limit your access to the ATMs that spit out money. And unfortunately, culturally, we haven't trained all of our peers outside of crypto to accept it as money. As a result, I live in Denver. If I weren't able to get the money back out in the fiat eventually, there's a couple coffee shops I could spend it at. It's maybe a restaurant. Maybe I could convince my landlord, hey, let's make a deal. I'll give you 6 months of Bitcoin in exchange for a break on the rent. But that's not the lifestyle that most people want. So we need to train people that you always have a choice. You know, if you work for some small business owner, tell him, hey, why don't I get paid 30% in Bitcoin? Just sign up on Coinbase. We're not there yet, but that's what we have to do is actually push.
Well, but here's the thing, you know, operating a business in dollars, if you're US based, it's very efficient. If you're trying to operate globally, it's very inefficient.
Right.
So the people who are the most frustrated, who are looking at this as a mechanism, whether it's to lower their fees or timely payment, are the ones who want to be cross-border. And that's, you know, the two messages that the central banks are hearing is, we want timely, low-cost cross-border payments, and we want to stop being debased.
And there's really another couple of things that need to be sort of consciously there anytime we're talking about Bitcoin. One is that there should be an intention on all of our parts to remember that 6 or so of the 7 billion people are underbanked and have no bank accounts. That's part of the reason why we're doing this Bitcoin thing anyway. And at least I am interested in making sure that all citizens of the world get an opportunity to have a bank account and compete and not end up with a dead-end life. Two, I also think that it's very important to look at it from the standpoint of there are transactional fees charged for moving that money across boundaries that disproportionately affect individuals who are the least likely to be able to afford it. If you're a Indian or Pakistani going to Dubai to be on the construction project, by the time you've sent the money back to your family, you've lost a big chunk of it. If you're picking agricultural products in the United States, same thing. And those things, if solvable by being able to transfer that information, that money, across those boundaries, will do more for the legitimacy of Bitcoin as a global currency than anything we can do, you know, arguing about the U.S. central banks. Because although that is a big issue, they can't fight the good that can be done. And it's really hard.
Wait, say that again?
They can't fight the good, meaning we've managed to give 7 billion people a bank account. The good there is that we've done that, and two, more than that, now they can transact business. And if they can transact business, they help even the greedy bastards who are, you know, abusing them because...
I think they absolutely want much better digital currencies.
Yeah.
They want that.
Yeah, and you can't give 7 billion people Bitcoin accounts because it's just too slow. But they can use crypto. Well, not a distributed ledger that's global. That will not work. And it's because of the whole nature of the concept of Bitcoin, which is like gold, which is a thing that you have to mine and you have to track it from point to point to point. And supposedly you have to keep track of it and all these computers. It already takes as much computing power to do one transaction or it takes as much electricity as a household uses in a day. And this is for a very small portion of the money supply. But I would say that the whole cryptography idea is great, and what has come off of blockchain is great. But the first generation of this model is not going to work. The banks themselves are not looking at blockchain. Well, Satoshi Nakamoto never used the term blockchain, so it's not really clear what a blockchain is. But they looked at blockchain at first, meaning a distributed ledger that was global, and they decided that it was too slow. And so now what they're using is something they're using Ripple, which is a series of blockchains or a series of ledgers, which is what banks do anyway. They clear ledgers within their own bank, and then at the next level they clear them at the level of the Federal Reserve, and at the next level they clear them through the SWIFT system. So this cryptography that they're looking at and using and liking is very efficient. It's good for everybody. It's cheaper. You don't have to have all these middlemen. But it is not literally a universal distributed ledger, which actually won't work.
Can I just ask, just kind of back to the topic at hand? We have an entire military-industrial complex, though, that's financed by essentially a petrodollar or a central bank system. How does that go away? Everything we talk about here with Bitcoin and these, this decentralized system, we still have this entire other system sitting there. What happens to that? How does that change?
It in theory atrophies over time, because it won't be providing the service that lets it grow and get stronger. It gets weaker. And I think market forces tend to make those kinds of decisions based on the behaviors we all adapt. I mean, 10 years ago, or at least 10 years and 2 months ago, there was not such a thing. Nobody in that time frame would have predicted that if they walked into a room, everyone would have one. So the market forces that had that happen and enabled the creation of Bitcoin, because wallets without having it, you wouldn't be able to do the things that Bitcoin are, and you certainly wouldn't be able to do version 1 of Uber without one of these devices. Even though Uber has still got a decentralization step to go through, meaning you've got to eliminate all the employees and let just software exist as the operating unit of Uber, or something that replaces it. We've got a situation where today there are technologies already being created that you can create a blockchain, a legitimate blockchain, and in 30 seconds, you can give it the full security model of the Bitcoin blockchain. It's as if you had all of the miners working for you. It's a concept called proof of proof, and it's at least one of the things that among many sharding sidechain strategies are going to elevate the performance of Bitcoin and its brothers and sisters cryptographically to accomplish all of the tasks that we today think it can't do. And I use the example of Kodak invented the digital camera. We don't see Kodak in that business because they thought it was too expensive, too slow, and nobody would buy one for $75,000. Well, today that's laughable because these guys set out to make a phone and they destroyed the camera business as a sideline, as a minor effort. And that's exactly what's going to happen with all technologies today that at least are all digital. Once they become digital, they become exponential. And once they're exponential, it makes your head spin.
I'd like to
I agree that-
add a caution to that. I agree with you about the power of market forces. But when the market forces start moving against the cartels or against the deep state, then it's no longer an even playing field because of this issue of who's got the force again. I think a good example would be in the field of healthcare, for example. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, health foods were just beginning to come on. People were not vitamin crazy like they are today, like I am today. And I remember when I wrote my book on cancer, which is an alternative therapy, there was only one health food store in Los Angeles. And in that period of time, we've seen the market force drive the demand for nutritional supplements way high. We've also seen a pushback by the pharmaceutical industry and the cartels there to the point where increasingly today you cannot go into a health food store and buy the vitamins and the minerals that you want because there are now laws against it, you see. The powers that be have lobbied the Congress, and now in the interest of protecting the people against quacks, they've limited our choice, and the market forces are getting limited and more limited until finally what they really want is every vitamin to come with a prescription from your doctor and be made by the pharmaceutical. So I'm just saying that we have to be cautious because market forces need to be defended in the legislature. And this, I see a pushback probably coming.
Or in the deep dark web.
Or in the deep dark web, yeah. So it's not going to be just because we have a better technology that it automatically will succeed. We have to be prepared to do battle to defend it.
No argument.
Yeah. Well, and that's the promise of cryptography, or what was started with Bitcoin, the idea that you can get all these ledgers to be totally transparent, that we can trace back where the money came from and where it's going to, so it can't be duplicated, it can't be rehypothecated, et cetera. And we could get rid of the dark money, the 19 trillion, or throw some people in jail, et cetera. So that's the promise of it, and it seems to me,
We will never find that money. Never.
and the whole Uber
Oh, I
thing,
disagree.
No.
How did they launder 19 trillion? I mean, when you buy a product or service or real estate.
19 trillion through government agencies and the New York Fed member banks. Their records we know are redundant.
So we could pull it back then. Just
You may not be able to pull the money, but you can identify the assets and assert common law right of offset.
I think I see a Jekyll book there. I can tell by its size and shape.
I'm confused about the 19 trillion missing compared to the debt. I'm confused about that.
Let's open this up a little bit for some other questions here at the end here. So, yeah, let's start with that. That's a good point. I'd like to know more too.
So in 1998, I was meeting, in 1997, I was meeting with the top pension fund leaders in the country, including the president of CalPERS. Is anybody here a beneficiary of the CalPERS system? Okay, so we have one. And I was showing him a model of how we could re-engineer the flow of money by place. So America's 3,100 counties. So if you could allow community currencies, if you could allow community equity, if you could allow optimization of government investment within place, federal investment, because right now, if we were to look at the federal investment in your county, it would have a highly negative return on investment to taxpayers. It's invested basically grossly oversimplified to prop up the stock market. So I said to this wonderful group of people, you know, we can turn the negative return on investment and do it in a way that can make the pension funds a fortune so that they can meet their retirement. And the president of CalPERS looked at me and he said, he froze and he said, "You don't understand." He almost started to cry. He said, "You don't understand, it's too late. They've given up the country. They've given up on the country. They're moving all the money out starting in the fall." And that fall of '98 started a process where we had passed a law in the first Bush administration requiring audited financial statements. And so it had kicked in, and so the agencies had to report. And a process began where the only two I've tracked are DOD and HUD. I haven't tracked the other 19 agencies. They started to report that they weren't going to produce audited financial statements, and they had a high amount of undocumentable adjustments. Now, an undocumentable adjustment is when you have a voucher transaction that isn't supported or isn't documented or you can't explain it. And so you just write it off. Okay, so imagine, for example, if you were earning $100,000 a year and your bank wrote to you and said, you thought you had $20,000 in the account, but you don't, it's gone, but just write down write in your bank account, undocumentable adjustment, $20,000. You say, oh, okay, as long as you don't do it again. So a process began where every year the government would report, DOD and HUD would report their undocumentable adjustments. By the time we hit 9/11, it was $4 trillion. Donald Rumsfeld did a very famous press conference on September 10th, 2001, saying, yes, we were missing, we had 2.3 trillion of undocumentable adjustments the year before. Anyway, so it was $4 trillion. There was tremendous political pressure to deal with this then. What happened, of course, was 9/11. A lot of the documents involved in that pressure got torn up or burnt. And as a result, the undocumentable adjustment process continued. And I've now been working with a professor from state and local government from Michigan State University, who has a team of graduate students identifying and helping me put all the documents up online. The undocumentable transactions are now up to $19 trillion. Now, we don't mean, if you have undocumentable adjustments of 19 trillion, you could have 2 trillion in cash missing or 30 trillion. There's no way to know, particularly because securities fraud makes anything possible. Okay? And the reality is whether or not you think you can get that money back or not, which is a political question, certainly is a legal matter. There's many pathways to do it. If we as a nation have a policy discussion about where do we go from here, we've got to take care of 20 trillion debt, it's a very different picture than you say, okay, there's a 20 trillion debt, and you have refused to operate the government finances by law since 1998. There's $19 trillion. You bring that back on the table, it's a different policy discussion with profound impacts for people who are owed money by the federal government. Now, why do I bring this up? There are many ways, I think, that the technologies we're talking about here could be used to enforce the Constitution. Because one of the reasons we have governments and large corporations running around the world acting entirely outside of the law is because they can finance acting out entirely outside of the law. And their number one source of financing is the federal credit mechanism. They can borrow an infinite amount of money and take an infinite amount of money and spend an infinite amount of money in an invisible way with no accountability. I mean, what's not to love, right? Right. So that's the question. How do we bring, Ed's been writing about this for years. You're trying to develop technology that can do it. How do we make sure that we create a way to not only bring everybody in the world in so everybody enjoys the prosperity, but get the governance system and within it the financial system on a basis which is optimizing health in all the different ways, whether it's the health of the planet or the health of me and you. And what I will tell you is the federal credit mechanism is the mechanism which is permitting the financing of criminal enterprise on a global scale. And what those guys want more than anything, I'm going to show it tomorrow in my presentation. Who here has seen Aaron Rousseau's interview? Everybody needs to watch it. I'm going to have excerpts tomorrow. Where they want to go is they want everybody chipped with digital currencies, and they can just, it's very easy to tax. You just take it out.
Is that a conversation about Rockefeller?
Yeah. But that's where they want to go. So,
These people are so delusional. 7.5 billion of us, and it's a handful of families, right? I mean, I think mathematically it doesn't work out.
That's how they're getting us.
I mean, I have to tell you, I've worked and dealt directly or indirectly with them my whole life. I think they're some of the most powerful, intelligent, capable, clever. I think, one of my teammates said, "You're making it too complicated. You have to make it more simple." I said, "Fine, I'll make this really simple. Chickens, farmer, livestock management. These people are fabulous at livestock management. They are it's arguably their greatest core competency.
Generationally.
This has been evolving for 500 years. We've been part of a central banking warfare system for 500 years, and now what we're talking about is inventing it. And what you're hearing here, which I think is really good, is it's going to be invented one way or the other. And this technology is going to be a part of it. And the question then is how?
Let's get over here. Yeah, your question.
So I guess I'm from another planet because I don't get this Bitcoin thing at all. For example, you showed me a figure today about the control of Bitcoin. What was it, 95% of control?
Not control, just concentration of ownership.
95% of Bitcoin is 4% of the IP addresses. And so then somebody else said about this whole blockchain thing. Well, what happens when AI invades blockchain? So to me, I think that everybody's being astonishingly naive about what's possible in terms of using this as a control mechanism, the internet as a control mechanism. This is their dream. Facebook is their dream.
Well, it is called Apple. What's the tail in the Bible, right? It's the bite out of the apple. It's the logo. So, but the concentration of IPs is partially just exchanges and like Coinbase and stuff having huge wallets.
It's so complicated.
So
If you sat down and spent, a week with him to tell you how the Federal Reserve works the system, it would take another 4 weeks for you to really know all the things that they do. Blockchain is an order of magnitude more complex than that. I want something simple. I want something that is not going to lose 40% of its value in a day because of manipulation.
2 weeks, not a day, 2 weeks.
Whatever the hell it is. That's not a currency that I'm going to trust or that the world can bank on. So to me, this is so bizarre. It's like, what is everybody talking about? This thing is a scam to begin with. It started by those guys that were with Facebook that were suing Facebook. And you got to imagine, everybody says we're going to run the world by algorithms. We're going to become a goddamn algorithm machine based on blockchain. What happens to our humanity in having something that you can trust, that's simple to understand, that buys me a Coca-Cola today at the same price as tomorrow, not 3% less since 1900, or 40% less than a week ago.
Well, let me come to the defense of cryptocurrency on that one. This is not a role I'm used to, by the way.
But I think your frustration with the performance of the Bitcoin is the false assumption that it's a currency. It is not a currency yet. We're talking about maybe someday. Wouldn't it be great? It's not a currency yet. What is it today? It's an evolving technology with a lot of interest and enthusiasm, but primarily it's a speculation investment. People are attracted to it not because it's a currency, but because they want to make some money. Free. That's the primary attraction. And that's so when you go into a risk type investment, a speculative investment, you have to expect volatility that comes with it, you see. So you're complaining that it's a volatile exchange system because you're expecting it to be a currency when that's not what it is.
Yeah. That's my notes.
Yeah.
It's a difference between a currency and speculative investment.
Exactly, yeah.
But
So-
people, everybody here is talking about it like it's a currency.
But it's not, yeah.
Go for it, yeah.
I see it as a flexible technology where you can see it as what you want. If I'm thirsty and I want his glass of water, or I want his autograph, we can have an agreement that the currency is Bitcoin. And the transaction would be valid. So is it a currency? Is it?
Well, it is, but it's not a very good one because it doesn't have many acceptors of it, you know.
Well, if last year I could have went to only one conference with Bitcoin, and this year I can go to 3 conferences with Bitcoin, is it a good currency? And I'm not speculating. I'm not even trying to have a lot of Bitcoin. I just have a couple. I have a couple of chickens. Oh, there's an egg. I can have a meal. So is it a currency? Is it a technology? What are we doing? I think that the words are a limitation. It's our idea. Like we have to break out of this.
All I know is that the biggest amount of anger comes from those people that hadn't bought. And that's because they didn't get a chance to speculate it, and they're angry that other people got to speculate and, in theory, got some money. It's the same feeling I had about Mark Cuban when he got away with being a billionaire without ever having a technology that even worked for a second.
Unusable video site,
Yeah.
broadband video before video.
Everybody wants to be Mark Cuban, you know, I mean, that's part of human nature. Well, then it's not for you. I mean, it's clear.
And that doesn't change what it is. Right now, we're kind of, I find that we're in luck because we have, it competes against a couple of cards that we have in our pocket. But there's millions of people who that will be their first financial infrastructure. That will be their first currency. That will be the first time where they'll be able to have a wallet and say, if you have this amount of currency, and it will be whatever name it is, but the technology is there. It's Bitcoin, it's Dash, it's whatever. But you'll be able to transact safely with no third party. And it will be a currency in your life. And that, for millions of people, this is a reality that right now it's applicable. And I think this is the most exciting thing ever. And it's not the luxury that it brings me. Because for me, the Bitcoin card, or it's just a level of luxury. Because even if I don't have it, I'll be sitting in the same room with you. But for some people who can leapfrog the financial infrastructure and say you have like a distributed consensus. Think about that. This is a distributed consensus.
That's what every currency. I mean, I can answer you.
Yes, yes.
I don't want to dominate. I can answer everything that you say.
You had a question here, right? You want?
I'd like to ask Ms. Smith something. I sense that you examine the cryptocurrencies as a tool for a much bigger undertaking of revolution.
Well, to me, any technology that is really powerful to either centralization or decentralization, to me, is of interest. My question is always, how can we help this be more decentralizing? So, you know, so to me, again, it's a very powerful tool, and I think, one of my frustrations, I've watched the financial industry my whole life just skim extraordinary amounts of money for transaction fees or, be very difficult and, basically be an obstruction. So any technology that simplifies the process and sort of can go beep beep, especially in international payments, and bring other people in, I think it's great. The one thing I would also say is I live in a community where there's this extraordinary amount of people who are unbanked, and they use money orders. They won't have a checking account, and they certainly won't use Bitcoin. And the reason is they're much safer. They're doing the smart thing.
My question was, I particularly enjoy listening to you speak with dark journalists.
Right.
And I've noticed perhaps you've spoken before about speculation about where that 19 trillion is. And when things like that are examined, you seem a little more reticent on the more recent episodes. And forgive me if this is not something I should bring up, but
No, bring up anything.
is there a breakaway civilization? Do we have to be concerned about more things than rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic about the
Right,
cryptos?
so let me, I'm gonna grossly oversimplify. Any financial system is a subset of the governance system.
Okay.
If I was to ask anyone in this room to go into a court of law and describe the governance system and document it, they couldn't, because it's a mystery.
Sure.
There's no one here, Ed Griffin probably knows more about the governance system than any of us, but there's nobody here who's really sure. Now, one of the things I believe is that the money that's been shifted through the bailouts, through the pump and dump of the tech stocks, probably making a lot of money on the pump of Bitcoin, has been shifted essentially to privatize government. So what we've done is we've shifted enough money out to create, whether it's the infrastructure, the technology, the endowments, the ownership, enough resources to basically create an independent world government run by private investors privately. Think of it, we've created an endowment for planetary governance, okay? Now, did it go for that? I don't know. I don't know where it went. Do I think a lot of it went into space? And do I think that technology, I call it the black budget technology, has it fueled a lot of things, including this? I think all of Silicon Valley, or most of the technology got transferred out of the black budget. And what is, an honest conversation about the governance system and an honest conversation about what's really happening with the black budget is what we need. Because we're operating, think about it, it's like a symphony playing music in the dark. We're operating in a world where we don't understand what the real governance system is and how it works.
We're going to have to close it down. I know there's a lot of questions here. Afterwards, if you guys want to talk some a little bit, but I want to thank all of you for coming here. I think it's been a really nice session to have and very informative. So thank you very much.